Welcome back. Tonight we step into the shadows of a chilling true crime story, dark, haunting, and unforgettable. Let's begin. On the cold morning of January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles awoke to a horror that would forever stain the city's history. In a vacant lot near South Norton Avenue, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where mothers pushed strollers and children played freely, a young woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter when she noticed something strange in the grass. At first, she thought it was a discarded mannequin, pale and lifeless, its body posed awkwardly in the dirt. But as she drew closer, dread tightened her chest. The figure was not a mannequin at all. It was the butchered corpse of a young woman, and her body had been mutilated in a way that seemed almost designed to shock the world. The body was naked, cut cleanly in half at the waist. The two sections had been carefully arranged, as if deliberately staged by the killer. The victim's arms were raised above her head in a grotesque, mannequin-like pose. Her legs were splayed open, revealing the indignity of her last moments, and her face bore a nightmarish mark. Her mouth had been slashed from ear to ear, leaving a ghastly, permanent grin carved into her lifeless features. The killer had not only ended her life, but had turned her body into a spectacle, an exhibition of violence meant to horrify. When police arrived, the scene stunned even seasoned detectives. The mutilation was precise, surgical in its execution. There was no blood at the scene, suggesting the victim had been killed elsewhere. Her body drained and then transported to the lot. Whoever had done this had knowledge of anatomy, or at least the cold discipline to dissect a body with methodical precision. The victim's intestines had been tucked neatly beneath her torso, as though the killer had arranged her remains like an artist composing a macabre masterpiece. The press descended almost immediately, their flashing cameras capturing the gruesome images that would fuel sensational headlines for weeks. Reporters, hungry for every lurid detail, pressed the police for answers. Who was she? Who could have committed such an atrocity? And why leave her in such a public place posed for discovery? By nightfall, the young woman had been identified. Her name was Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress with pale skin, jet black hair, and striking blue eyes. Born in Boston and raised in Massachusetts, she had drifted west to chase the Hollywood dream, like so many others during the golden age of cinema. Friends and acquaintances knew her as Beth, but the press, ever eager for a sensational hook, quickly gave her a new name, the Black Dahlia. The nickname played off her penchant for wearing black dresses and her rumored association with a recent noir film titled The Blue Dahlia. It was a moniker that transformed her from a struggling young woman into a tragic icon, forever frozen in the public imagination. But behind the headlines and the mythology, Elizabeth Short had been just another hopeful in a city filled with dreamers. She had worked odd jobs, dated a string of men, and spent nights in the smoky jazz clubs and diners of Los Angeles. Friends described her as kind, charming, and sometimes secretive. She wanted to be a star, to see her name in lights, but she had little money and few connections. The last time she had been seen alive was on January 9th, when she had been dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She told an acquaintance she was meeting her sister, but no one ever saw her leave the building. For nearly a week, she vanished into the shadows of the city until her body was found in that vacant lot, mutilated beyond comprehension. As the investigation began, detectives faced a chilling puzzle. There were no fingerprints at the scene, no blood, no weapon, and no witnesses. The body had been washed clean before being dumped, stripped of any trace of the killer. The staging suggested premeditation, an almost theatrical display of brutality. This was not the work of a desperate attacker or a random act of violence. This was ritualistic, deliberate, and personal. The killer wanted her body to be found and wanted the world to see what he had done. The LAPD formed a task force, but the case quickly spiraled into chaos. The press hounded investigators for updates, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Elizabeth had lived a double life, associating with dangerous men in Hollywood's underworld. Others speculated that she had been the victim of a jealous lover, or that the murder was tied to organized crime. Every lead seemed to point in a different direction, and none led to a definitive suspect. But what gripped the city most was not just the horror of the crime, but the enigma of Elizabeth herself. Who was this young woman who had met such a nightmarish end? In life, she had been a dreamer, drifting from city to city, writing letters to her family about the life she hoped to build. But in death, she became something else entirely, a symbol of Hollywood's darkest underbelly, where ambition and desperation mingled with predation and cruelty. The Black Dahlia was no longer just Elizabeth Short. She was a myth, an icon of innocence destroyed, a haunting reminder of how quickly dreams could become nightmares. As detectives combed through her past, they discovered a web of acquaintances, lovers, friends, and strangers who had crossed her path in her final weeks. She had been seen with servicemen, nightclub owners, and even Hollywood insiders. Each name added another layer of intrigue, another potential suspect. But the brutality of her murder suggested something deeper than jealousy or chance. The surgical precision hinted at someone with medical knowledge. Some began to suspect a doctor, a surgeon, or someone with access to morgues and medical equipment. This theory gained traction when an anonymous caller, claiming to be the killer, began taunting the police and newspapers, promising to send proof of his identity. Days later, a package arrived containing Elizabeth's personal belongings, her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book. The items had been carefully cleaned with gasoline to erase fingerprints. The killer was not only mocking the police, he was inserting himself into the narrative, feeding off the fear and attention his crime had generated. For the city of Los Angeles, the murder was a rupture, a wound that revealed the darkness beneath the glamour of Hollywood. The newspapers splashed lurid headlines across their front pages. "Black Dahlia murder most brutal in city's history," one proclaimed. Reporters painted Elizabeth as both a tragic victim and a dangerous temptress, fueling the public's obsession with her death. Women across the city whispered in fear. Men scanned the papers for new details, both horrified and fascinated by the gruesome spectacle. The Black Dahlia case had become more than a murder investigation. It was a cultural phenomenon, a reflection of America's post-war anxieties, and a grim tale of innocence lost in the city of angels. Yet for all the headlines, the investigation remained mired in confusion. Witnesses contradicted one another. Suspects were questioned, then released. More than 150 men were eventually considered possible culprits, ranging from ex-boyfriends to drifters to high-profile figures. Some confessed, but their stories quickly unraveled. Others denied any connection, but remained under suspicion. The case grew colder with each passing week, and the pressure on the LAPD intensified. Still, detectives clung to the details of the crime itself, hoping the brutality of the murder might point to its perpetrator. The bisection of the body was a key detail so unusual, so specific, that it could not be ignored. Medical examiners confirmed that the cut had been made with skill, likely with a surgical instrument. It was not a crude dismemberment, but a calculated separation along the spine, executed with precision. Whoever had killed Elizabeth Short had wanted to leave a mark, to make a statement. and to ensure his crime would be remembered. As the city buzzed with speculation, one truth remained clear. Elizabeth Short's life had ended in unimaginable terror, and her killer was still out there, watching, perhaps even smiling at the chaos he had unleashed. The Black Dahlia was no longer a young woman chasing dreams of stardom. She was a ghost haunting Los Angeles, her mutilated grin frozen photographs, her story destined to echo for decades as one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. The days following Elizabeth Short's discovery brought not clarity but a storm of confusion, suspicion, and hysteria. The Los Angeles Police Department, already under scrutiny for corruption and incompetence in other cases, suddenly found itself in the eye of a national media frenzy. Reporters camped outside police headquarters, desperate for leaks. Radio broadcasters repeated every rumor, each more sensational than the last. The Black Dahlia was no longer a case, it was a spectacle, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Detectives Harry Hansen and Phoenix Brown were assigned to lead the investigation. They were veterans, but even they were shaken by the brutality of the crime. To them, Elizabeth's body was more than evidence, it was a message. Someone had taken the time to pose her like a grotesque piece of artwork. Someone had wanted her death to be noticed, dissected, and remembered. And now, with the press feasting on every detail, that desire was fulfilled. The killer's arrogance became even clearer on January 24th, just over a week after the murder. A suspicious envelope arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. The letter was composed of cut-out words from newspapers and magazines, arranged ransom note style. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Inside the package were several of Elizabeth's personal effects, her birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and an address book embossed with the name of a man she had once known. The belongings had been scrubbed clean with gasoline, erasing any trace of fingerprints. The killer was taunting them, confirming his role, and dangling hints of Elizabeth's life before them, like bait. The address book itself became a point of fixation. It had belonged to Mark Hansen, a local nightclub and theater owner who was known to keep company with aspiring actresses. Hansen admitted that Elizabeth had stayed with him briefly, but denied any romantic involvement. Investigators weren't convinced. Hansen was wealthy, influential, and had access to many women who came to Hollywood chasing dreams. Was Elizabeth simply another in a line of women he used and discarded? Or had she rebuffed him only to pay the price? For a time, he was considered a prime suspect. But in the absence of physical evidence, Hansen slipped through the cracks, one name in a growing sea of suspects. Meanwhile, the killer continued to toy with authorities. More letters arrived in the weeks that followed, some handwritten, others constructed from cut-out words. One chilling message read, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Another contained a crude map pointing to a location that turned up nothing. Each letter pulled investigators deeper into the killer's game, a dance of fear and control that mirrored other notorious cases of the era, such as the Zodiac Killer years later. The press published the messages, fueling speculation that the murderer was following the headlines and savoring the chaos he had unleashed. As the investigation deepened, the LAPD found itself chasing hundreds of leads, each one more bizarre than the last. More than 150 men confessed to the crime, many seeking attention, others clearly disturbed. Some claimed to know intimate details of Elizabeth's life, but their stories quickly unraveled under scrutiny. The sheer volume of false confessions became a burden, clogging the investigation and distracting detectives from viable suspects. It was as though the entire city had been infected by the Dahlia's ghost, her death pulling the desperate and deranged into her orbit. The medical examination of Elizabeth's body offered haunting clues. The bisection of her torso had been made between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, a difficult cut that required precision. The medical examiner concluded it was likely performed by someone with surgical training. The flesh had been cleanly severed, the organs carefully removed and replaced. This was not the work of a sadistic amateur. It was someone who understood anatomy. Perhaps a surgeon, a medical student, or someone with access to a morgue. This detail pushed investigators to probe local hospitals and medical schools, scouring records of doctors, interns, and medical personnel who might have had both the skill and the opportunity to commit such an act. One name that surfaced was Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy and eccentric physician who lived in a sprawling, eccentric mansion in Hollywood. Hodel was known for his brilliant mind, his strange parties, and his reputation as a womanizer. He was rumored to have a dark fascination with death and sexuality. Though his name wouldn't come under serious suspicion until years later, the possibility that a doctor with such interests could have been involved haunted detectives. Even in 1947, whispers circulated of men in positions of power, insulated by wealth and influence, who preyed upon young women with impunity. But for the LAPD, the most immediate challenge was the unrelenting glare of the press. Newspapers were printing every rumor they could find, that Elizabeth had been involved in prostitution, that she had been pregnant, that she had been living a double life. None of it was substantiated, but the public devoured it, and the victim's reputation was shredded. Elizabeth Short was no longer remembered as a hopeful young woman with dreams of Hollywood stardom. In the papers, she became a caricature, a femme fatale, a loose woman, someone whose lifestyle had somehow invited her grisly fate. This victim-blaming narrative not only exploited her death, but also obscured the truth. In chasing scandal, the press distorted the very person Elizabeth had been, turning her into a phantom created by headlines. Detectives tried to cut through the noise. They retraced Elizabeth's last known movements. On January 9th, she had been seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She told an acquaintance she was meeting her sister, but no meeting ever took place. Some witnesses claimed she left the hotel alone. Others insisted she left with a man. After that, she disappeared. For 6 days, her whereabouts remain a mystery. What happened in that gap remains one of the central enigmas of the case. Was she held captive by her killer, subjected to unspeakable torture before her death? Or was she lured into a trap, her murder carried out swiftly but with grotesque deliberation? The condition of her body suggested she had been brutalized before death. Lacerations on her thighs and breasts indicated she had been tortured, perhaps for days. Whoever killed her had not only murdered her, but reveled in her suffering. As the city reeled, detectives found themselves surrounded by dead ends. Every lead seemed to circle back into the same fog of uncertainty. Lovers, acquaintances, strangers, they were questioned, interrogated, and released. Some suspects were credible, others laughable. One man confessed after reading about the murder in the papers, only to admit later he had made it up for attention. Another, a soldier stationed nearby, claimed he had dated Elizabeth, but evidence disproved his account. The case grew colder with each passing week, but the media refused to let it die. The Black Dahlia had become an obsession, her mutilated smile haunting the front pages long after her burial. Beneath the spectacle, though, a darker question lingered. Why? Why had Elizabeth been targeted? And why had the killer chosen to display her body in such a grotesque way? Some criminologists believed the staging was symbolic, that the killer was enacting a fantasy or ritual. Others thought it was a message to the city itself, a declaration of power and control. By leaving her body in a public place, mutilated and posed, The killer had ensured his crime would not remain hidden. It was a performance, and the world was his audience. The LAPD, struggling to keep pace, began to fracture under the weight of the case. Internal disputes, media pressure, and the sheer volume of false leads created a chaotic environment where progress was nearly impossible. Detectives Hansen and Brown pushed forward, but their resources were stretched thin. The city wanted a resolution, but the truth was slipping further from their grasp. As weeks turned into months, the likelihood of solving the murder seemed to fade. Elizabeth Short's name became synonymous not with justice, but with mystery, horror, and exploitation. And yet her killer still loomed unseen. He had walked the same streets, read the same headlines, perhaps even smiled at the chaos he had created. His letters revealed a man who craved attention, who wanted to insert himself into the narrative, but who remained just beyond reach. The police were chasing a phantom, and the phantom was winning. The Black Dahlia case was becoming more than an investigation. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of post-war Los Angeles. The corruption of the police, the cruelty of the press, the vulnerability of women lured to Hollywood by dreams of stardom. And at the center of it all was Elizabeth Short, a young woman whose tragic death had become a stage for the city's deepest fears. As weeks turned into months, the Black Dahlia investigation began to resemble a hall of mirrors, every suspect reflecting fragments of possibility, every lead dissolving into contradiction. The brutality of Elizabeth Short's murder demanded answers, but Los Angeles seemed unable, or perhaps unwilling, to provide them. While the newspapers continued their endless coverage, behind closed doors the investigation was already starting to unravel. Corruption within the LAPD, pressure from politicians, and the killer's deliberate taunting created an environment where truth itself was hard to distinguish from rumor. The list of suspects had swollen to staggering proportions. By spring of 1947, more than 150 people had been interrogated, ranging from petty criminals to high-profile figures. Many were lovers or acquaintances of Elizabeth Short, men who had crossed her path during her time in Los Angeles. Some were nightclub owners, others were servicemen or drifters. Each seemed plausible, yet none could be definitively tied to the crime. The absence of physical evidence, the killer's careful cleansing of Elizabeth's belongings, the lack of blood at the crime scene meant that the police were forced to chase shadows. Among the early suspects was Robert "Red" Manley, a married salesman who admitted to being one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive. Manley had picked her up in San Diego and driven her to Los Angeles, eventually dropping her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9, 1947, the last verified sighting before her disappearance. The police grilled Manley relentlessly, certain that he had to know more than he admitted. But Manley passed 2 lie detector tests and was released. Though suspicion lingered in the public imagination, there was nothing concrete to tie him to the murder. In truth, he was just another name swallowed by the Dahlia's endless web. Then there was Mark Hansen, the wealthy nightclub owner whose address book had been sent to the press in the killer's package. Hansen admitted to knowing Elizabeth well. She had stayed in his home briefly, and some rumors suggested he had made advances she rejected. Did her refusal wound his pride enough to provoke violence? Or was his name in the package a deliberate plant designed by the killer to mislead investigators? Hansen's wealth and influence kept him insulated, and without hard evidence, detectives were forced to let him go. Still, whispers about his involvement persisted for years. But the most chilling name among the suspects would not fully emerge until years later: Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was a wealthy physician, a brilliant and eccentric man who lived in a sprawling Hollywood mansion known as the Soden House. The structure itself seemed ominous, a Mayan revival design with imposing stone walls and cavernous rooms that resembled a temple. Within those walls, Hodel hosted wild, hedonistic parties filled with artists, intellectuals, and socialites. To outsiders, he was charismatic, enigmatic, even charming. But beneath the surface lurked something far darker. Hodel had a reputation for cruelty and decadence. He was a known womanizer, accused by his own daughter of sexual abuse. He was fascinated by surrealist art, especially the works of Man Ray, which often depicted women in fragmented, dismembered forms. To those who would later revisit the case, the connection was chilling. Elizabeth's mutilated body, posed with surgical precision, resembled the imagery of those surrealist works. Had Hodel been enacting a grotesque fantasy, blending art, sex, and death into one horrifying tableau? At the time, Hodel's name crossed the desks of detectives, but he was not yet their prime suspect. Still, evidence was mounting that someone with medical knowledge had committed the crime. The surgical bisection of Elizabeth's body required skill, and Hodel had the expertise. His proximity to Hollywood, his history with women, and his reputation for cruelty painted a sinister picture. Decades later, Hodel's own son, a former LAPD detective named Steve Hodel, would publicly accuse his father of being the Black Dahlia killer, citing evidence he uncovered in the family archives. But in 1947, Hodel was shielded by wealth, power, and the city's own corruption. Corruption was perhaps the greatest obstacle of all. The LAPD in the 1940s was a notoriously compromised institution, riddled with ties to organized crime, Hollywood elites, and politicians. Detectives were known to take bribes, cover up scandals, and bury evidence that implicated powerful men. For many, the Black Dahlia case was not just a murder investigation, but a test of whether the police could rise above their own decay. The answer, tragically, seemed to be no. Some insiders whispered that Elizabeth's death was tied to a larger network of exploitation powerful men, preying upon vulnerable women who came to Los Angeles chasing stardom. Elizabeth was far from the only young woman to vanish or meet a violent end in that era, but her death was the most grotesque, the most theatrical. It was as though the killer wanted to send a message, to remind the city that its glitz and glamour were only a thin mask over rot. The more investigators dug into Elizabeth's life, the more emerged. Friends described her as sweet, quiet, and somewhat naive. Others painted her as manipulative, drifting from man to man, always seeking security or opportunity. The press amplified the darker image, portraying her as a dangerous seductress. But in reality, Elizabeth was likely something far simpler. A young woman alone in a predatory city, caught between dreams of stardom and the grim reality of survival. She had no steady income, no stable home, and often relied on acquaintances for shelter and food. To the wrong man, she was vulnerable. To a predator like her killer, she was perfect prey. The cruelty of her murder, the methodical mutilation, the stage display suggested a killer who wanted more than just violence. He wanted control. He wanted to erase her identity and replace it with his own narrative. By cutting her body in half, by carving her mouth into a grotesque smile, he had transformed Elizabeth Short into the Black Dahlia. She was no longer a woman. She was a symbol, his creation, his message to the world. In the months after her death, the case became less about solving the murder and more about feeding the spectacle. The newspapers continued to print wild speculation, dragging Elizabeth's reputation through the mud. Headlines accused her of being a prostitute, of consorting with dangerous men, of living a double life. Each story, no matter how false, sold papers. The truth of who she had been, a hopeful, struggling young woman, was lost beneath layers of sensationalism. The police, under relentless pressure, began to lose control. Tips poured in daily, most of them worthless. Some were cruel hoaxes, others bizarre tangents. Psychics came forward, claiming visions of the killer. One anonymous caller insisted the body had been arranged to mock the Virgin Mary. Another claimed the murder was connected to a satanic cult. The detectives had to sift through it all, knowing that every hour wasted on nonsense brought them no closer to justice. Yet, despite the chaos, the figure of George Hodel lingered like a shadow over the case. Though not arrested in 1947, suspicions about him simmered beneath the surface. Years later, when the LAPD secretly bugged his home during an unrelated investigation, Hodel was recorded making chilling statements. At one point, he was heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." The words preserved in police files became some of the most damning evidence against him. But by then, the case was already cold. For the city of Los Angeles, the Black Dahlia had become both an obsession and a curse. Elizabeth Short's ghost haunted the streets, her mutilated smile a reminder of the darkness that thrived beneath the neon lights. The investigation was collapsing under its own weight, the killer slipping further from reach with each passing day. And as the first anniversary of her murder approached, it was clear the Black Dahlia would not be solved easily, if at all. Her story was no longer just a murder mystery. It was a parable of Hollywood's cruelty, a tale of innocence devoured by corruption, a mirror reflecting a city's worst sins. And at the center of it all remained a single, horrifying question. Who had killed Elizabeth Short? And why had he chosen to turn her death into such a grotesque performance? The answer, it seemed, was buried not just in evidence, but in the very soul of Los Angeles, a city where dreams and nightmares walked hand in hand. The years after Elizabeth Short's murder stretched into decades, and with them came layers of myth, speculation, and obsession. Los Angeles, a city built on dreams and deception, seemed cursed by this crime, an eternal reminder of how beauty could be consumed by darkness. The Black Dahlia became less a victim in the public's imagination and more an icon, a symbol of something cruelly intoxicating about Hollywood's underbelly. And yet, behind every headline and rumor, there remained a very real young woman whose life had ended in unimaginable horror, and a very real killer who had walked away untouched. As the 1950s dawned, Los Angeles police had little to show for their efforts. Hundreds of confessions had been logged, many from drunks, criminals hoping for notoriety, or mentally unstable individuals who latched onto the story. Detectives sifted through each one, only to discover that none could withstand scrutiny. Yet the allure of confessing to the Black Dahlia murder became almost fashionable, as if attaching oneself to the crime could confer a twisted kind of immortality. This phenomenon frustrated investigators, wasting valuable time while the trail to the actual murderer grew colder with every passing week. Still, police kept circling around several recurring figures. One was a former surgeon whose background in anatomy lent itself chillingly to the precision of Elizabeth's mutilation. Witnesses had reported him as erratic, cruel to women, and possessing the kind of detached arrogance that could feed such an atrocity. Another suspect was a nightclub owner with alleged mob ties who was rumored to have known Elizabeth personally. But each lead ended in dead-end alibis that held up, lack of hard evidence, or political interference that strangled progress. The press, meanwhile, only inflamed the spectacle. Tabloids published sensational claims Elizabeth had been seen at a shadowy Hollywood party. Elizabeth had been linked to high-ranking officials. Elizabeth had been punished for uncovering a scandal. Whether true or not, these stories kept readers enthralled. Journalists often went so far as to taunt the police in print, boasting of having more insight than detectives. This antagonism pressured the LAPD, but also forced them into mistakes, chasing down salacious angles rather than focusing solely on the tangible. As years blurred into decades, theories multiplied like shadows. Some whispered that Elizabeth's killer had been shielded by connections to the elite, perhaps a powerful studio head, or a wealthy man with influence that could silence investigators. Others believed she had crossed paths with a sadistic drifter who vanished into anonymity. There were even those who argued her murder was ritualistic, carried out by a cult or secret society. The grotesque staging of her body lent itself to such speculation, its theatricality suggesting symbolism beyond mere cruelty. But the most enduring theory came from closer to home. In the late 1990s, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel accused his own father, Dr. George Hodel, of being the Black Dahlia killer. George had been a brilliant but deeply unsettling physician, rumored to host decadent, perverse parties at his Hollywood mansion. He was once investigated for the murder of his secretary, but charges were never filed. Steve Hodel presented evidence. Photographs resembling Elizabeth found among his father's belongings, transcripts of police surveillance, in which George allegedly made incriminating statements, and a disturbing overlap between his father's surgical expertise and the precision wounds inflicted on Elizabeth. While controversial, Steve Hodel's claims reignited public obsession. The idea that a respected doctor, mingling with Hollywood's elite, could have committed such a monstrous act while hiding in plain sight fit perfectly with the city's reputation for glamour masking corruption. Yet skeptics argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the photographs inconclusive, and Steve's motives potentially clouded by a son's bitterness toward a cold, abusive father. To this day, his theory divides true crime enthusiasts and historians alike. The city of Los Angeles never officially closed the case. Somewhere in the LAPD archives, the Black Dahlia murder file remains, thick with reports, photographs, and interviews, waiting for a definitive answer that may never come. Forensic technology advanced, and in recent decades, some hoped DNA might unmask the killer. But contamination, degradation of samples, and bureaucratic red tape meant that the promise of modern science has yet to deliver resolution. Yet perhaps the cruelest legacy of Elizabeth Short's murder is how it reduced her in the public eye to a myth, stripping away her humanity. For years she was spoken of as the Black Dahlia, as if that was all she had ever been, a noir fantasy, a character in someone else's story. Rarely was she remembered as a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who longed for belonging and perhaps a chance at stardom. Her mother, Phoebe Short, endured a lifetime of grief. After Elizabeth's death, she was haunted by reporters who hounded her for lurid details, sometimes pretending to offer sympathy only to exploit her words. She never saw justice for her daughter. Her pain became a quiet, tragic echo overshadowed by the circus of speculation. Hollywood itself seemed to absorb the crime into its mythology. Films noir of the era reflected Elizabeth's story in shadowed femme fatales and doomed dreamers. Later, books and movies would resurrect her in fictionalized accounts, each twisting her memory into a story that suited their narrative. The real Elizabeth was lost in the process, her voice drowned by the chorus of obsession. But the unsolved nature of the case ensures its immortality. Uncertainty breeds fascination, and the Black Dahlia remains one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. Her image, pale skin, dark hair, the haunting smile of publicity photos lingers like a ghost. The horror of her death and the void of justice ensure she is never forgotten. And so, Los Angeles carries scar. Each generation revisits the Black Dahlia murder, peeling back layers of rumor and conjecture, hoping to glimpse the truth. But the truth is slippery, buried under decades of lies, mistakes, and lost evidence. Perhaps the killer was a powerful man who hid behind wealth. Perhaps he was a nameless predator who vanished into the night. Or perhaps, as some suggest, he was someone known all along, his identity obscured by corruption and incompetence. What is certain is the terror Elizabeth must have felt in those final hours. What is certain is the cruelty inflicted upon her after death, turning her body into a message, though what that message was, we may never know. And what is certain is that somewhere, even now, the ghost of the Black Dahlia lingers, forever bound to the city that devoured her dreams. The darkness of the Black Dahlia case is not simply in the murder itself, but in the reflection it casts upon society. The willingness to exploit tragedy for headlines, the indifference of systems meant to protect, and the endless hunger of a city that consumes the vulnerable. Elizabeth's short story is a reminder that behind every myth lies a human being, and behind every mystery lies a crime that destroyed a life. In the end, the Black Dahlia is not just a tale of death, it is a mirror, showing us the lengths to which cruelty, apathy, and obsession can stretch. And until the day her killer is named beyond doubt, the shadows of Los Angeles will always whisper her name. Elizabeth Short, The Black Dahlia, forever unsolved, forever haunting. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share